Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what is the dark triad? If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. That way I won't miss anything new. Now, when we talk about the dark triad, we're talking about a theory that there are three specific personality traits that can come together to cause specific difficulties. And these traits are narcissism, psychopathy, and a trait referred to as Machiavellianism. Now, the idea with this theory is that all three of these traits share a personality trait called antagonism, which we could conceptualize as low agreeableness on the five-factor model. Now, a number of studies have been conducted on the dark triad. Sometimes they're referred to as the dark traits. I'll be using a study here published in 2018 by Vize and colleagues. And this study was actually a meta-analysis. So this study studied a number of other articles published on the dark triad. So the idea is that themes can be found by looking at a number of studies that would be missed in any particular one study. So let's take a look at these three different traits. Now, it's first important to understand that these are traits. These are not necessarily disorders like personality disorders. For example, with narcissism and psychopathy, we could conceptualize extreme narcissism in some cases as narcissistic personality disorder, and we could conceptualize psychopathy sometimes, particularly extreme traits, as antisocial personality disorder. But that's not what we're talking about here necessarily with the dark triad. So in looking at narcissism as it relates to the dark triad, we see that there are really two different kinds of narcissism, grandiose and vulnerable. With grandiose narcissism, we see traits like being dominant, arrogant, exploiting other people, and exhibitionism. And with vulnerable narcissism, we see characteristics like being shy and distrusting other people, having mood lability, so unstable mood, and being self-critical. When we look at the research on the dark triad, most of the research is really referring to grandiose narcissism and not really vulnerable narcissism. Now, with psychopathy, we see other characteristics, and of course there may be some overlap with narcissism in many cases. But we see characteristics like violating social norms, being callous, having a lack of empathy, being impulsive, irresponsible, having a superficial charm, and being manipulative, and having shallow affect. Now, when we look at the research that studies psychopathy related to the dark triad, here we're really talking about a continuum, where there can be subclinical psychopathy all the way up to clinical psychopathy. So it's important to make this distinction between psychopathy as a continuum with very few symptoms all the way up to a clinical presentation and the way we see it in the mental health literature. So when we look at it from a mental health perspective and we compare psychopathy to antisocial personality disorder, the way we usually think about this is that most everyone with psychopathy would qualify for a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, but only some individuals with antisocial personality disorder would qualify as having psychopathy. Again, this is looking at it from a clinical perspective, and we look at the dark triad, the whole range of psychopathic characteristics and levels are considered, not just the clinical. Now, the last trait in the dark triad is Machiavellianism, and we don't really see this mentioned in the clinical literature very much. This is really something we see more in literature related to careers. So with Machiavellianism, we see characteristics like being manipulative, callous, being goal-oriented in kind of a negative way, and usually again related to career goals. Having a satisfactory to good level of impulse control, which of course makes it different than psychopathy, and tending to be related to white-collar crime or at least white-collar antisocial behavior. Now, an important point with Machiavellianism is that there's no clinical impairment here with this particular trait. So with psychopathy, there may be, depending on where the levels are, but with Machiavellianism, there would be no clinical impairment. This isn't considered a clinical construct. So we know with the dark triad that the idea here is that these subclinical presentations come together, usually in the workplace, to cause particular types of problems, to create poor leaders, to create distress in organizations, and ultimately to decrease productivity. So these different characteristics don't have to be related to disorders, as I indicated, but they do come together in a special way. At least that's what the theory indicates. So what does research tell us about the dark triad? Well, there are mixed results. Mostly everyone would agree that narcissism is not the same thing as psychopathy, that these are two distinct traits. Sometimes there's an overlap, of course, between them, but overall they're considered distinct. However, there is disagreement around Machiavellianism and psychopathy. Some would argue that the impulse control component differentiates these two constructs. So with psychopathy, of course, we see low impulse control, and with Machiavellianism, we see high impulse control. Others would argue that only really narcissism and psychopathy are distinct, and Machiavellianism is really a subclinical variant of psychopathy. So they would look at psychopathy as really almost always being clinical, and then we have this subclinical piece, this subclinical variant that we could call Machiavellianism, and perhaps there's more impulse control with this variant. So this brings up the question, is there such a thing as the dark triad? Are these three characteristics really distinct, and do they come together in some special way to cause difficulties? Well, when I look at the research literature here, I'm really not convinced the dark triad is real in the sense that these different characteristics are distinct enough, these different traits are distinct enough where we should consider them separate. I believe there's certainly a good case to say that narcissism and psychopathy are distinct, and these two constructs may come together in certain ways that cause difficulties that you wouldn't see with just one of these traits. But Machiavellianism really does appear to be covered by the construct of psychopathy. I don't think we really need Machiavellianism as a separate construct. I don't think it adds any value to the model. So instead of a dark triad, I usually think of this more as a dark dyad. A triad, of course, indicating 3 elements, and a dyad indicating 2. So really the dark dyad would contain just narcissism and psychopathy. Again, this is just my opinion. There are a lot of opinions about the dark triad or the potential existence of the dark dyad, and I am interested to see what research tells us in the future. I hope you found this description of the dark triad to be interesting. Thanks for watching.